towards the end of the webinar. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So I wanted to talk a little bit about NCLD's mission and the history of NCLD before we jump right into the topic. So NCLD's mission is to improve the lives of the 1 in 5 children and adults with learning and attention issues. We've been around for about 43 years, and we started out as a foundation, but quickly transitioned into a nonprofit advocacy and policy organization. And so we've been working at the national level to improve the lives of these children and adults who have learning difficulties. So how are we defining learning and attention issues? So learning and attention issues are brain-based difficulties that affect the brain's ability to process and store and respond to and communicate information. People with learning and attention issues are just as smart as their peers, but they may struggle with things like reading, math, writing, or some social learning, attention issues, and focus. But we know that with the right supports, students can thrive in school and life. But one of the important things is to identify these challenges early on. And so with the pandemic, we've noticed that many parents are seeing signs of learning difficulties that they may not have seen before. And often these students might struggle, but they might get back on track with the right supports. But if these problems persist, it may be a sign of a more serious issue, such as a learning disability. So if these signs persist, that could be something that you might want to talk to an educator or a pediatrician about, because often these are not diagnosed until later on in life, which could result in students not getting the help they need when it's most impactful, which is early on in a child's development. So in an effort to help respond to this issue, NCLD has created the LD checklist, Recognize and Respond. This interactive tool can be found at www.ncld.org/LD checklist. And it's a tool that is supposed to help parents identify potential signs of learning difficulties. It's not meant to diagnose a learning disability or an attention issue, but it is meant to help jumpstart a conversation with your child's educator or pediatrician. So I wanted to quickly go through how this LD checklist works. So first, the user, typically a parent or an educator, is able to choose what grade the child is in that they're concerned about. So we've separated it into 4 different categories: preschool, grades K through 4, grades 5 through 8, and then high school and young adult. So the user can select this and then move into what subjects or areas of concern that the user might have about their child or student. So we've separated it into these different categories. And one thing I wanted to highlight is that often these are co-occurring difficulties. So a child might struggle in math, but also might struggle with attention issues, or might struggle with reading comprehension. So once the user has selected that, based on the age and the categories that they've selected, the user then gets this page, which based on the subject area, has different signs that could be potential signs of learning difficulties. So the user can check these that they've seen in their child. And I think it's important to remember that you should think back quite a ways in the child's development process. Think back for 6 months or so, whether these have been persistent patterns of difficulty. And I will highlight that next to some of these items are examples of what this could be. So one of the items here is difficulty estimating. There's a little graphic that the user can click on and get an idea of what this difficulty could mean. In addition, there's some of these highlighted sections, and that provides definitions of what we're talking about when we have these different items on here. So then once the user goes through the checklist, it pre-populates a checklist that the user can download and print off and take to their child's educator or pediatrician. In addition, you can download the full checklist. So this is all the ages and all the categories that we have listed on the checklist. There's also a Spanish version if you're looking for that as well. And then there's also resources based on the items that you've selected. So if you selected pre-K math issues, we've curated a library of resources to help a child's educator or a child's parent support their child or student in the difficulty area that they've identified. In addition, we have questions that you can ask your child's pediatrician or your child's educator to sort of start the conversation on whether you think this is a more serious issue or whether your child is just typically developing as they should and that they're just struggling in one area. So with that, I'd love to jump in and to talk with my colleague Sheldon and our wonderful guest from the National PTA, Minnie Martinez, to talk about some of the importance of the early detection of learning difficulties. So first, I wanted to introduce my colleague Sheldon Horowitz. Sheldon has been with NCLD for close to 25 years now. He is our senior advisor and in-house expert on learning and attention issues. Prior to NCLD, he was the Associate Director of the Learning Diagnostic Center at Schneider's Children's Hospital in New York. He has a master's degree from Vanderbilt University and a doctorate degree from Teachers College at Columbia University in New York as well. With us also is our special guest, Minnie Martinez. She's the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Fellow at the National PTA. In addition, she's the local president, she's the president of her local school in Florida, president of the PTA at our local school. She has 3 children, one of which is identified as having a specific learning disability in reading comprehension. And so, Minnie, thank you so much for joining us to talk about this topic and to talk about your experience having gone through the sort of a process of having your son identified as having a disability and at what point in his development that was. So my first question is just to get to know a little bit about your experience when your child was diagnosed and how that process went for you.
Hi, thank you so much. And I'm so delighted to be a part of this webinar today. I want to give a special thanks to the National PTA for trusting me to represent them and also to the National Center for Learning Disabilities. It is a great privilege and honor to be able to share my story with so many of you today in hopes that I would inspire you to ask questions, dig deeper, and also share the knowledge that I have gained along the way. So I am a mom of 3. I have a 14-year-old son. I have an 11-year-old daughter, and I also have an 8-year-old daughter. My son was diagnosed with a specific learning disability when he was in 3rd grade. The journey for my son, as the data often shows, is that the signs of the learning disability didn't truly manifest until he was in 3rd grade. We switched schools at that year, and he was blessed enough to have a teacher with training in special education. And it was that educator who walked me through the process of saying, his diagnostic scores are lower than what they should be. I would like to recommend him for Title I services. And so, not having any experience because he was my eldest, I agreed to whatever would be able to help my son. Pausing for a moment and just rewinding, as I reflected to prepare for this webinar, I realized that actually in 1st grade, I saw small hints of things that I really didn't know what to do with. And so I would like to share them just for the sake of maybe helping another parent who has early primary children. In 1st grade, I recall emailing my son's teacher and asking if she felt he had any issues with focus and attention. I don't recall specific examples at home, but it was something where I reached out because she was telling me that she felt he was just under when it came to his fluency and reading. So from first grade to second grade, there was not much talk about anything academic except that he was a great student, he was on track. In third grade, everything switched. Part of my journey included speaking to both the teachers and his third grade teacher and the educational team that was providing services for him, and also his pediatrician. And so it was those many conversations that really helped shed light on my son's specific learning disability, and specifically a deficit in reading comprehension.
Yeah, thanks for that overview, Minnie. And so Sheldon, um, I'd like to ask you like why students are not identified earlier, and why third grade is so when we start to see a lot of identification of kids with learning disabilities.
Well, I'd like to start by saying thank you, Mimi, for being with us. Great story. You know, the care with which you observe and report and share your data is going to be helpful for just so many parents. The big takeaway for me from what Minnie just shared was that parents' intuition is so important, and the ability to capture the kinds of things that a parent sees and wonders about and worries about is the perfect entree to getting the right kind of help for a child as early as possible. Way too often parents and teachers set themselves up for this conversation where they're blaming each other, and schools are saying, well, you didn't do this, or you're not providing support, or a child is not developing accordingly, and it goes back and forth. Just being able to say that there's this unexpected mismatch between effort and output, between instruction and learning, between what I sense is my child's ability and how it is they're performing, which is the very definition of a learning disability, that's a perfect launching point for conversation. Why students are often not identified until later in their elementary school career has a lot to do with language, has a lot to do with vocabulary development, and has a lot to do with early literacy, of the evolution and the development of early literacy. There's sort of a mantra in the education space that, you know, prior to third grade, you're learning to read. And then once you hit third grade or fourth grade, you're reading to learn. And children who are not right up to that cusp, developing those skills, developing vocabulary and comprehension skills, as might have been the case with Minnie's child. That's why, point in time, lots of schools decide, well, let's take a closer look. Or lots of parents say, wait a second, we need to have a conversation. The most important thing is for teachers, educators, decision makers in school, and parents and children themselves to be talking about these things. Where are the frustrations? Where are my strengths? Where are my interests? But why isn't it working the way it's working for, apparently, you know, I see other kids learning quickly. Where is it breaking down? And it usually happens sometime. It could happen earlier. It could happen, you know, for some kids when they hit middle school, but it very often happens just at the cusp of the end of third grade, entering fourth grade.
Yeah, thank you, Sheldon. And this reminds me of Minnie when I was talking about this with you earlier, that your son was diagnosed with a specific learning disability in reading, but was later diagnosed with an attention issue. And I was wondering what your experience was with sort of the early diagnosis versus a later diagnosis, and how that worked with your child and your experience, and how they eventually got support for also ADHD.
So my son, as Sheldon just mentioned, he was diagnosed precisely at the end of third grade for his specific learning disability and reading comprehension. As time went on, I would say that myself as a parent and also the educators, we focused on whatever we could to help give him tools and make him successful in the area of reading. As he progressed through the end of elementary school and into middle school, I found that in 6th grade, I was just noticing other signs at home that gave me a hunch that perhaps he had some clinical attention deficit. And so again, that was something where I partnered with the pediatrician's office and the educational team to have him screened for attention deficit. And he was diagnosed actually in March of this year with attention deficit disorder, the inattentive type.
Yeah, thank you. And so Sheldon, I wanted to ask you about like that co-occurring and why it's sometimes difficult to diagnose different learning disabilities or attention issues and how that interacts with each other.
It is not at all unusual for children who have a learning disability to have a co-occurring attention disorder, and vice versa, those who have attention disorders to struggle with learning. Some people estimate that overlap to be as high as 40 or even 45%. The challenge, as Minnie so beautifully described, is that it's not as though one thing happens and the other waits. You know, very often they happen at the same time, and the challenge for an educator, the challenge for a parent, the challenge for a pediatrician is to say, all right, how do we attack this? If we were to think of the child as being so, if the child presents as being so distracted and so overactive or so impulsive that it's interfering with their learning, treating ADHD first might actually open the window of opportunity to look more carefully at learning disabilities or the possibility that learning disabilities are at play. Similarly, if you think that a learning disability is the most prominent set of characteristics or features of LD are being prominently displayed by the child, and you address those over time, if not enough progress is made, or if something about the child's profile suggests that there may be something else happening, then looking at ADHD is the right way to go. But there isn't any one sort of preferred approach. It really is looking at the child using your intuition as a parent, asking the right questions, engaging, as Minnie so beautifully did, the pediatrician who has expertise in one area, educators who have expertise in other areas, and then sort of being the glue that holds that conversation together to make sure that both of those classifications, the LD and ADHD, if they're appropriate, are made at the right time as early as possible, and that any treatment, any interaction, any intervention is mindful of both. So in developing a plan for your child, think about what their ADHD characteristics are and then map what it is that your child needs based on their ADHD, as well as what specific issues they may struggle with, be it learning to read, math, doing comprehension, written expression, whatever.
Thanks, Sheldon. And so, Minnie, the other question I wanted to ask you is, how has your experience changed with, I think we talked about your son being home more often now during this this pandemic, and what signs you've seen that maybe you didn't see earlier, and how sort of what you would say for a parent who is like is concerned about whether their child is just struggling at school or whether there's a more serious underlying issue. What types of signs would you tell a parent to look for, and then what they should do afterwards if they think there's something that needs to be done?
Okay. I would first and foremost say, as Sheldon has repeated, you know your child best. Trust your intuition as a parent. If something doesn't feel right, there's no harm in just asking questions. For my son, it eventually evolved to include resistance in reading, resistance with homework help, and not just, I don't want to do it because I'd rather play soccer. Nothing like that. It was just real emotional resistance that oftentimes included waves of self-defeat and questioning his own ability. And so there's a difference between a child who's just interested in playing, engaging in extracurricular events, and a child who really has the struggle and needs support. Pre pre-COVID, and in that time of distance learning when we were all shut down in March and having to finish the school year, it was interesting because I was able to see firsthand as his virtual educator what exactly the teachers are seeing and experiencing in the classroom. And so I was able to see what his attention threshold was. I was able to see his skill set with problems, where it was that he was getting stuck at, or where he excelled at and he needed very little support. And so I would look for those signs early elementary. Again, any type of behavior manifestation that would indicate, let me just ask. And again, for me, I started with asking my pediatrician, very closely with the third grade teacher who just held my hand and walked me along a process that I was not familiar with. So as you take time to reflect on your child, and as you engage the learning disability checklist, I would really even encourage you and motivate you to think back. If your child is late elementary or early middle school, it's not too late, because what's at stake here is your child's potential and the reality that it can be for your child to excel in a beautiful and a different way. They just might get there in a different path, different modalities, and that's not a bad thing. It's actually a beautiful thing, because you're your child's number one advocate, you're your child's number one fan, and that's a huge component of this process.
Yeah, thanks for that. And so, Sheldon, I'd like to go back to you and discuss some signs. We say early signs, but we really mean early signs at specific ages or sort of stages in a child's development. So can you talk a little bit about how some signs might change over time, or look differently as a child gets older?
As Minnie described in her own child, the early signs of learning struggle manifest in some language comprehension issues early on, evolved into some other kinds of issues that had to do with paying attention. I think there is no single profile of a child with a learning disability. So you could have a child, for example, who seems to be learning to read really well, loves to be read to, has an expansive vocabulary, but it occurs over the first couple of years of school that they increasingly struggle with reading words that are unfamiliar, or as vocabulary and comprehension become much more important in teaching and learning, they struggle as those tasks become more multi-layered and more complex, multi-sequenced. Looking carefully at that child, you may then discover that their decoding skills are not great, but their language comprehension skills are terrific. So you just have to get them to be better readers, or you need to provide an accommodation where things are read aloud to them. That's one profile. Then you can have a child who reads beautifully and quickly and accurately, and then if you ask them comprehension questions, they don't remember what they read because they were spending so much time and energy on the reading of it and not on the, well, what am I reading and what does it mean, and connecting the dots in terms of meaning. So very important to think about learning disability or learning disabilities as an umbrella under which there are lots of different manifestations of specific types of disabilities. And even within one area, like in reading, there are 4 or 5 or 6 or even a dozen different profiles of what might constitute a child with a learning disability. So important not to sort of think one way. The other thing is that by definition, kids with learning disabilities are bright. I mean, there's nothing about their cognitive potential that is holding them back. And I mean, that in fact is one of the rule outs for having a learning disability. So you can have kids who are really bright, who sort of find some way to mask the things that they're not able to do really well until they get into 5th grade or 6th grade. And then all of a sudden they're working so hard to do things that should be relatively simple based on what people are looking at and thinking about their trajectory in learning. Um, you know, there are lots of kids who are twice exceptional, who are gifted and have a learning disability, because a learning disability is very specific to a particular area, one particular area, or numbers of particular areas. So the manifestations of LD do change over time as students become better at able to accommodate and as they learn new skills. I think it's important not to think about LD as one particular thing that stays the same throughout the trajectory of a child's, life experience.
Thanks, Sheldon. That was really helpful. So one thing I wanted to ask Minnie is that we often try to combat the sort of stigma of having a learning disability. And I wonder, as you were going through sort of the screening and evaluation process, were you at all concerned about having your child identified as having a learning disability? And what would you say to a parent who might be concerned about having their child identified as having a learning disability?
I wasn't so much concerned about the identification of having the learning disability as much as I was, as a parent, concerned about how that would look and feel for my son in the classroom. And specifically in regards to pull-out services versus support in the classroom. And that took some time for me as a parent, because you become their advocate, especially if they end up getting an individualized education plan, what we call an IEP, that allows for these services and or accommodations. You as the parent are going to be the one who is the biggest advocate for your child. So as a parent, for example, I thought that providing my son a quieter space with fewer students in the classroom would set him up for success in terms of testing, a testing environment. It turned out that that created more anxiety and in my son, and we tweaked the IEP to remove that because it wasn't benefiting him. It was creating more dis-ease in my son. So one thing I would like to note as a parent is that it took me some time to embrace everything that a learning disability involves. Because he was my first child, because I don't have a learning disability, and not understanding all of the components about it, it took me time to do a lot of researching, sharing with other parents who have gone through the journey before me, to get to a point where I understood this is not about fixing anything so much as it is about best supporting. And that's a message that I really would like to highlight and stress. Our children, again, are wonderful just as they are. And the fact that they may need support in different areas is a wonderful thing. I would also like to share that as a parent of 3 children in my home, we celebrate everyone's strengths, and we also talk about openly everyone's struggle or area of growth or area of support. And so sharing with my son about his learning disability, having open conversations with him about his accommodations and what it means has been helpful in terms of if any internal stigma should be manifesting within him that maybe he's not sharing. That has really been a powerful tool to just have open conversations about celebrating, well, perhaps you do need support in this area, but we're going to use that support to our benefit because what's at hand is your education and your growth and your potential.
And I can't stress that enough. I think you said it beautifully, Minnie. One of the preeminent neuroscience researchers in dyslexia used the phrase to describe a learning disability by saying that kids have islands of weakness in a sea of strengths. And if you think about who our children are, we want them to understand that learning disability it's not a prescription for failure. It's not what defines who they are. It's what they have and what they need to work through and around to be able to celebrate their strengths. you alluded to stigma being internal and external, and I think that's absolutely critical. Our kids look to us, and I think in ways that are hard for us even to understand sometimes, and they look to us for validation. They're looking at us for cues about how they should feel and think about themselves. So if we as parents, and guilty as charged, if we as parents who have kids with learning and attention issues don't really understand and feel positive about what it means to have a learning disability and how to work through that, that's going to register in some ways with our kids. And it's going to create a challenge for them as they think about how to negotiate the world. The years that I spent doing evaluations and working in hospital-based evaluation and treatment centers, we did a lot of testing and we did a lot of naming and explaining things. But the one major takeaway that I always left my families with, and I always left my clients, my kids, the ones who I did the testing with, I wanted them to have the language to be able to say, I have a learning disability, I'm cool with it, you should be too, but here's what I need from you. Here's what I need to succeed. This is the specific accommodation or set of accommodations that if you give them to me, I can achieve in your classroom, or I can be successful on the job. The more parents can set that up, the more parents can convey that positive message, and the more parents can sort of move the responsibility of saying that over to their child, be it a child in elementary school, certainly middle school, and absolutely during high school, the more likely it is that they'll be successful and our work will have sort of reached the levels that we want, that will have the impact that we want on our child's future.
Yeah, thanks, Sheldon. And so, Minnie, one thing I wanted to ask you was about your experience going through, like, trying to detect these issues early on, and your experience with educators and pediatricians, and how you were able to navigate that system where it's sort of half in the school and sometimes it's at the doctor's office, and sort of, I'd love to hear more about that experience.
Yes, so as I have learned and continue to learn over the years, is that some of the issues are clinical in the case of attention deficit, and some of them are educational based, which would be the learning disability. Both expertises are indispensable, really. And so you may find on your journey that the advice of the pediatrician informs your thought process and your decision making in one way, and you may find that the educators may inform your thought process and your decision making processes in a completely different way. What I will say is that both are necessary for that comprehensive plan to best serve your child. And so one thing that the pediatricians helped me with was to to rule out auditory processing. And so on the clinical aspect, at the end of 5th grade, we did hearing test and auditory processing screening to see if that too was contributing to my son's learning disability. Few years later, actually, we just did a repeat evaluation, both private, meaning through my doctor's office, and then within the school system to compare results. And there's nothing wrong with comparing results, because this is your child and you want to know everything you can know about your child so that you can advocate for those accommodations or services that will set your child up for success. So I would say absolutely have those conversations in tandem, because what one may miss, the other may pick up on. And in a lot of cases, the data that is revealed out of these testings and screenings, they may just confirm what the other party was thinking. So I do believe, and I have used on my own journey, both the pediatrician and the educator's perspective.
And I would say that, you know, pediatricians and the nurse practitioners and other folks who work in their offices, they are often more than happy to contribute in meaningful ways, but they don't have a relationship with schools. They have a relationship with parents who have a relationship with schools. So even going to the physician, for example, and saying, could you write a note that I can submit to the school about my child's ADHD, describing what ADHD is in ways that they can understand it, and then state for the record that it doesn't mean that my child needs to have expectations lowered in terms of their academic achievement ability. Just something from the doctor could be very powerful, could really sort of make sure that those conversations and planning and the ways that the IEP goals are crafted, or even if it's not a IEP, if it's a 504 plan, or even if there are some informal accommodations that can be made, if a child doesn't qualify for any formal services and supports, having the experts weigh in can be very, very powerful.
Yeah, so before we open it up for audience Q&A, I did want to say that, well, first, feel free to ask any questions in the chat box. And then I also wanted to say that a closed captioning version of this, this webinar will be available once we upload it to our YouTube page. So I know we got one of those questions early on. So thank you for that. So Minnie, before we turn it over to the audience Q&A, I did want to, my last question would be, what would you have wanted to know before you started all of this that you'd like to share with parents who might just be beginning in their journey to supporting their child who may have a learning disability?
Once again, I would say, ask lots of questions, be alert. You know your child best. If something doesn't feel right, take those steps to inquire. Whether it be the pediatrician's office, whether it be with your child's immediate teacher or teachers, something will surface, because it will, as you faithfully explore. And so I would say, be bold, be courageous. This is your child. This is your child's future and potential at stake. And you have been gifted the opportunity to advocate for your child. And so I will say that the journey can be emotional at times as you figure this out, as you ask questions. For me, again, he was my first child, first experience with learning disabilities or attention issues. And it felt overwhelming in seasons, but there were other seasons where clarity came and I felt empowered. I would also say, speak to other parents around you. There is a wealth of knowledge from peers, colleagues, friends, neighbors. One would be surprised to know just how close to home in our communities the learning disabilities are in terms of prevalence. And that has been a huge beacon of hope for me as on my journey. I've had amazing friends and colleagues that have held my hand literally and have introduced me to new resources. I think that the learning disability checklist provided by the NCLD is phenomenal. I wish I had that tool maybe 6-7 years ago, but nonetheless, it has worked out. So I would say keep researching, keep probing, keep asking questions, and of course, continue advocating and being your child's #1 fan.
Great, thanks, Minnie. And so one of the first questions that I think Sheldon, you could answer is, what sort of factors should a parent look at in terms of genetic factors or environmental factors? Is that something that can impact a child whether they have a learning disability or not?
The answer to the question is absolutely yes. LD runs in families, as does many other neurobiological traits. If you look to the left, to cousins and brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles, and on both sides of the family, it's likely that you'll see someone who has a learning disability. Not always, but very often. So that could be an indication of risk. but is not necessarily diagnostic in any way. I wouldn't worry about it more. I think it just validates that there is in fact good reason to think that there might be a connection. We know something about the sort of the genome profile of learning disabilities and ADHD and other neurobiological disorders. We're not that sophisticated yet. We can't take a blood test, and we can't do a brain scan, and we can't, spit into a test tube and have it, worked up in a laboratory to diagnose, even to predict whether or not someone has a likelihood of having LD or ADHD. But we do have pretty sophisticated observational tools that allow us to be able to identify kids early, very early, in fact. And there's some really fascinating work that's being done by researchers in Boston and University of Connecticut that's looking at infants and whether or not there are infant responses, sort of neurometrics that can actually help us understand whether a child will be at risk. It's very early emerging research, but very interesting. We do know a lot about the biology or the neurobiology of reading, neurobiology of dyslexia, which is a learning disability in reading. We know a little bit about, and not as much, but some about math. And so these are evolving, but yes, there is a genetic component. We believe there is a familial component. I am not sure that there is a well-established literature on environmental factors that cause learning disabilities. There are lots of environmental factors that cause insult to brain development. There are lots of air pollution, and there are like lead, for example, is a teratogen. It's actually a poison to the nervous system. But I don't think of those as learning disabilities per se. Those are insults that can cause learning disabilities. There are also disease entities that can cause learning disabilities or manifest themselves as learning disabilities.
Yeah, thanks, Sheldon. So our next question, I think, is targeted towards many, is what would you say, or did you have any experience with an educator who might have said, it's okay, he's young, he'll catch up in time. We don't have to do a screening or an evaluation at this time?
Hi, and I believe this comes from Nicole. Nicole, I have had that happen with my son being a boy. Obviously, I've often heard he's a boy. Boys take longer. In 6th grade, he's a boy. In 7th grade, he's a boy. And that was not just in reading comprehension. That was in things like even organization and self-advocacy. The gender specificity has always been brought up, or has often been brought up. I would say continue to support your child the best way that you know how to support them. Continue to raise questions, continue researching and finding someone who will help you maybe to articulate your point and your concern in a way that maybe that specific educator is not capturing at the moment. I wouldn't stop searching. I wouldn't stop, as we say, fighting, because what's at stake again is your child's learning potential, which we know is there. It just needs some specific support. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, and I know it's not a direct and correlation, perhaps not a perfect analogy, but if you worry about your child's or wonder about your child's ability to hear, or you have concerns about their sight, or if they're having what looks like pre-asthmatic or pre-diabetic kinds of issues, you're not going to wait. You're not going to see if they outgrow those kinds of things. I mean, those are the kinds of things that as a parent, you are going to worry about, and you should worry about them before they cause larger problems and become much more impactful in the child's overall development. Think about how many hours a day prior to COVID a child spent in the classroom, and think about during COVID how many hours a day a child is spending doing reading and writing and math and spelling and the kinds of things that are precisely the kinds of characteristics that we attribute to a learning disability or an attention problem. So why would anybody want to wait? I mean, now's the time, as soon as you see those kinds of things, to begin a discovery process where you can become educated so that those problems don't trigger issues with self-esteem, so that it doesn't become a problem with socialization and your child feels different than his or her peers, so that it doesn't become a problem about, well, should the teacher be doing this or should I be providing that? That's why screening is so easy and so important.
Thanks, Sheldon. Yeah, I think that's a great way to end the conversation. So once again, I'd like to thank Sheldon, my colleague, and Minnie Martinez from the National PTA for joining us today. I think that was a great conversation. I did want to highlight a few resources that both organizations have that could be helpful as you are looking at this issue that your child might have. So National PTA has a special education toolkit, and that can be found at pta.org/special education. They also have a great suite of resources to assist parents during the COVID-19 crisis. We've been talking about the LD checklist a lot. That can be found at ncld.org/LD checklist. And we also have some COVID-19 resources for parents and educators as they grapple with this pandemic. And we'd love for you to continue the conversation with us on social media. We've been using the hashtag #CheckForLD, which is down here at the bottom right. And you can find us on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. And you can also find the National PTA on those platforms as well. So with that, thank you again. A recording of this will be on our YouTube page shortly. Thanks again to the National PTA, and thank you very much for everybody who has been joining us today. And we hope to talk to you soon.